"Sir, this is a religious ceremony, clergy and invited church officials only." The young deacon barely glanced up from his leather-bound registry, his manicured finger tracing down the list of approved attendees. His tone was crisp, rehearsed, like enforcing exclusion was the holiest of duties. Marcus Williams didn't flinch. He simply stood there, 11 sets of dog tags creating a quiet metallic symphony against his chest, with each labored breath. He wore his only suit, black wool pressed that morning, older than the deacon himself. The chains around his weathered neck caught the morning light filtering through stained glass windows, each piece of metal telling a story the young man couldn't begin to comprehend. Some tags were pristine, their edges sharp. Others darkened with age and something else. "I served with Father O'Brien," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades. "Hill 847, Korea, 1952. If you believe promises made in war are sacred forever, type promise in the comments. This story will break your heart and rebuild it." But what the young deacon didn't know was that each piece of metal around Marcus's neck carried the last words of a dying soldier. 11 boys who never made it home from a frozen mountainside in Korea 71 years ago. Boys who had whispered their final confessions to a 19-year-old private who promised them they wouldn't die alone, without God's grace. Marcus stepped back from the cathedral entrance, his weathered hands instinctively closing around the tags. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of incense and autumn leaves from the courtyard maples. Through the heavy oak doors, he could hear the organ beginning the funeral mass for Monsignor Patrick O'Brien, the only priest who ever understood what those dog tags really meant. The only man who knew why Marcus Williams had never taken them off, not once, in 71 years. The Gothic spires of St. Michael's Cathedral rose 200 feet above the city, their stone facades weathered by decades of storms and seasons. Marcus had driven 4 hours to get here, his arthritic hands gripping the steering wheel of his 20-year-old pickup truck. The pain in his joints was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. He was losing the last person who remembered Hill 847, the last person who understood. The sound of approaching footsteps made Marcus look up from his reverie. A group of clergymen hurried past, their black robes rustling against the stone steps like the wings of crows. Their faces were set with the solemnity appropriate for a Monsignor's funeral. None acknowledged him. To them, he was just another old man lingering where he didn't belong, another veteran whose war stories had grown tiresome with age. "Excuse me, sir," the deacon called out, his voice sharper now, cutting through the morning quiet. "You need to move along. This is a private service. If you're not on the list..." Marcus's fingers found the first tag without conscious thought. Coleman, Thomas R. The metal was smooth from decades of touch, worn thin in places where his thumb had traced the letters countless times. But he could still feel the tiny dent from shrapnel, still remember the way Tommy's blood had frozen on the metal in the Korean winter. Tommy had been 19, same age as Marcus. His last words were about his mother's apple pie, about how he'd promised to come home and help her with the harvest. "How many of those things do you have?" The deacon's tone carried barely concealed disgust, the way someone might ask about a collection of bottle caps or campaign buttons. "This is a house of God, not a military museum." Marcus met his eyes steadily. The young man was maybe 28, with soft hands and the kind of confidence that came from never having questioned his place in the world. 11, Marcus said simply. "One for each man who died in my arms." The deacon's face contorted with something between pity and revulsion. "Look, sir, I understand you may have served, but Father O'Brien was a distinguished Monsignor. This service is for church hierarchy, not..." He paused, searching for the right words that wouldn't sound too cruel. "Not for people who collect war memorabilia." "Not what?" Marcus's voice remained steady, but something in his pale blue eyes made the deacon take an unconscious step back. There was depth there, an ocean of experience that the young man couldn't fathom. The cathedral doors opened again, releasing a wave of sacred music and warm air scented with frankincense. Marcus caught a glimpse of the altar, where a simple wooden casket sat surrounded by white lilies and burning candles. The casket looked small from this distance, impossible to believe it contained the body of the giant who had saved 11 souls on a frozen mountainside. Somewhere in that crowd of black-robed figures, bishops and priests from across the country had gathered to honor a man they knew as a distinguished clergyman. But Marcus knew him as something else entirely. As the young chaplain who had crawled through mortar fire to reach dying boys, who had whispered prayers and granted absolution even as enemy shells fell around them. The chaplain who had been willing to die to ensure that 11 soldiers didn't meet their maker with sin on their souls. The only man who understood why Marcus Williams had carried these tags for 71 years. The only man who knew the weight of the promise that had shaped every day since November 15th, 1952. Then something happened that changed everything. The deacon's radio crackled to life, the static cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. "David, is there a problem at the main entrance? Bishop Patterson is asking about some kind of disturbance." "Just some old man with a collection," the deacon replied, not taking his eyes off Marcus. His voice carried the practiced patience of someone dealing with an unfortunate but familiar problem. "Claims he knew Father O'Brien. Has this morbid display of military tags. I'm handling it." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, not anger. He'd lost the capacity for anger somewhere on Hill 847, buried it with 11 boys who would never grow old. Something deeper. Something that had kept him awake for 7 decades, that had made him visit 11 different graves every Memorial Day, that had prevented him from ever feeling truly at peace. Morbid? Marcus's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the cathedral steps like a prayer. Other church officials had begun to notice the commotion. Word traveled fast in religious circles, and within minutes a small crowd had gathered at the cathedral steps. Their whispered conversations created a buzz of judgment and curiosity. Some pointed at the tags with the kind of fascination reserved for carnival oddities. Others shook their heads in disapproval, as if Marcus's presence somehow diminished the sanctity of the occasion. A middle-aged priest approached, his face set with administrative concern. "Is there a problem here? We're about to begin the service." "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises," the deacon continued, emboldened by the audience and the support of his colleagues. "This kind of display is inappropriate for a religious ceremony. These are just pieces of metal." The words hit Marcus like shrapnel. Just pieces of metal. He thought of Tommy Coleman's last breath, the way the boy's eyes had focused on him with desperate hope. He thought of Miguel Rodriguez, who had cried for his mother in Spanish before the cold took him. He thought of David Kim, the youngest of them all, who had whispered about angels singing just before the light faded from his eyes. That's when Marcus did something no one expected. He began to speak the names. "Coleman, Thomas R., age 19. Last words. Tell Mama her pie recipe dies with me. She'll need to teach someone else." Marcus's fingers moved to the second tag, his voice growing stronger with each name. "Rodriguez, Miguel A., age 20. Last words, the snow. It's so beautiful here, like Christmas morning." The murmur of the crowd quieted, something in his tone cutting through their casual judgment. "Kim, David S., age 18. Last words. I can hear angels singing. Do you hear them too, Marcus?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly on the name. David had been the baby of the unit, still had braces on his teeth when they shipped out. "Patterson, William C., age 21. Last words. Is my wedding ring still on?" "I promised Sally I'd never take it off." He continued down the line, each name a meditation, each set of last words a prayer he'd carried for 71 years. The crowd had gone completely silent now, the weight of the recitation settling over them like snow. The deacon reached out to stop him, actually touching one of the tags with his soft, uncalloused fingers. Marcus pulled back as if struck by lightning, his entire body recoiling from the contact. "Don't," Marcus whispered, his voice raw with decades of pain. "Please, they're not just metal. They're confessions, last rites, sacred promises made to dying boys who trusted me to remember them." The deacon's hand hovered in the air, frozen by the intensity of Marcus's reaction. "Each one of these tags," Marcus continued, his voice barely audible but somehow reaching every person in the growing crowd, "contains the last words of a soldier who died calling for his mother, his wife, his God. Boys who asked me to promise them they wouldn't be forgotten. Boys who died believing that somewhere, someone would remember their names. Little did they realize that someone else was listening. Someone who had been watching from a second-floor window of the cathedral. Someone whose face had gone completely white at the mention of those names. Someone whose hands had begun to shake uncontrollably as memories came flooding back across 7 decades. Someone who remembered a frozen night in 1952 when a young soldier had carried a wounded chaplain 20 miles through enemy territory, losing 3 toes to frostbite, but saving the only man who could grant final absolution to 11 dying boys. Someone who had spent 71 years wondering what happened to the soldier who saved his life. The person watching from above suddenly felt his hands begin to shake uncontrollably. Marcus had moved away from the crowd now, seeking refuge beside an ancient oak tree in the cathedral courtyard. The tree was older than the building itself, its massive trunk scarred by time and weather, its roots deep enough to have witnessed countless seasons of grief and celebration. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Marcus's feet as he slowly lowered himself to his knees, his arthritic joints protesting the movement with sharp spikes of pain. With trembling fingers, he laid out the 11 dog tags on the ground in front of him, arranging them in a perfect circle on the carpet of fallen leaves. The morning sun caught the metal, creating small pools of light that danced and shifted with each breeze. This was his ritual, the one he'd performed at every funeral, every memorial service, every Veterans Day when the weight of being the sole survivor became too much to bear. Morrison, Robert K., age 20, last words, "Tell Jenny I kept my promise. Tell her I stayed faithful." Marcus touched each tag as he spoke, his fingers tracing the raised letters worn smooth by decades of handling. Thompson, James L., age 19. Last words, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." He never finished the psalm. His voice cracked and broke. For the first time in 71 years, Marcus Williams began to cry. Not the quiet tears of grief that he'd shed at funerals and memorials. These were the deep, body-shaking sobs of a man who had carried 11 souls on his shoulders for 7 decades. Who had promised dying boys he would remember their last words, their final moments, their desperate need for absolution. Who had lived every day since with the crushing weight of being the one who survived when better men didn't. Through his tears, Marcus whispered the story no one else knew. How young Chaplain O'Brien had crawled from foxhole to foxhole that terrible night, administering last rites even as Chinese mortars fell like deadly rain around them. How the chaplain had been hit by shrapnel just as the final boy, little Danny Morrison, who'd carried a picture of his girlfriend in his helmet, breathed his last. How Marcus had made a choice that defined the rest of his life. Instead of advancing with the retreat, instead of following orders and saving himself, Private Marcus Williams had hoisted the wounded chaplain onto his back and begun the longest walk of his life. 20 miles through enemy territory, through blizzard conditions that reduced visibility to mere feet. 20 miles, with 11 dog tags burning against his chest like brands, with the chaplain's blood seeping through his uniform, with 3 toes slowly freezing solid inside his combat boots. He'd talked to the chaplain through the night, keeping him conscious, keeping him focused on staying alive. He'd recited the names of the 11 dead boys, their last words, their final requests. He'd made the chaplain promise that if they made it to safety, if somehow they survived, he would say masses for the souls of those 11 soldiers. His blood ran cold when he saw. The figure in the cathedral window whispered to himself, his aged hands pressed against the glass. Because Bishop James Patterson, the most senior military chaplain in the United States, a man who had dedicated his life to serving God and country, had just recognized something that made his 73-year-old heart skip a beat. Those dog tags. That face, aged now but unmistakable. that voice reciting names he thought he'd never hear again outside of his prayers. The boy who had carried him to safety wasn't a boy anymore. He was a broken old man, still keeping a promise made in a frozen hellhole 71 years ago, still carrying the weight of 11 souls who had trusted him to remember. Stop the service. The words rang out across the cathedral courtyard with such absolute authority that even the birds seemed to pause their singing. Bishop James Patterson moved down the stone steps with the deliberate pace of a man carrying the weight of divine purpose, his purple vestments flowing behind him like royal robes. The thick fabric rustled in the morning breeze, the gold threading catching the sunlight and throwing tiny rainbows across the weathered stone. His presence commanded immediate attention. Conversations died mid-sentence. The small crowd of church officials parted like water before the prow of a ship, their faces reflecting confusion and awe. This was one of the most powerful men in the American Catholic Church, someone whose word carried the authority of decades of faithful service. When Bishop Patterson spoke, people listened. Marcus looked up through his tears, squinting against the sun that created a halo effect around the approaching figure. Recognition was impossible. The morning light turned the bishop into a silhouette, a divine presence descending from on high. But something about the voice, something about the way the man moved, stirred memories that Marcus had buried deep. 20 miles, the bishop said, his own voice shaking now with the weight of recovered memory. You carried me 20 miles through the worst blizzard Korea had seen in 50 years. Marcus's hands stilled on the dog tags, his fingers frozen in place as impossible recognition began to dawn. 3 toes. The bishop continued, stepping closer, his shadow falling across the circle of metal tags. You lost 3 toes to frostbite because you wouldn't leave me behind. Because 11 boys had died in your arms and you needed to make sure they received last rites. The crowd gasped as Marcus slowly rose to his feet, his knees trembling not from arthritis but from the shock of recognition. The face before him was weathered now, marked by 7 decades of service and responsibility. But the eyes, Hill 847, Bishop Patterson whispered, and the words fell between them like stones into still water. November 15th, 1952. You were 19 years old and you saved my life. Marcus stared at the face before him, his mind struggling to reconcile the young chaplain he'd carried to safety with the distinguished bishop standing before him. The boy's face was gone, replaced by the weathered features of a man who had spent 70 years in service to God. But the eyes were the same, kind, compassionate, haunted by memories of war. Chaplain O'Brien? Marcus's voice was barely audible, cracked with disbelief and decades of suppressed emotion. Father Patrick was my younger brother, the bishop said, tears now streaming down his weathered cheeks. He never stopped talking about you. About the soldier who saved his life, who helped him give final absolution to 11 dying boys. He spent his entire priesthood trying to find you, to thank you. The revelation hit Marcus like artillery fire. Your brother? Patrick became a Monsignor because of what happened that night. Bishop Patterson continued, his voice gaining strength as the story poured out. He dedicated his life to military chaplaincy because he said he owed a debt to 11 dead soldiers and the boy who made sure they didn't die without God's grace. Every mass he said, every soldier he counseled, every prayer he offered, it was all in honor of what you did. The bishop reached into his vestments with shaking hands and pulled out something that made Marcus gasp. A photograph, creased and faded, the edges worn soft from handling. It showed a young chaplain and an even younger soldier, both barely recognizable beneath layers of mud and exhaustion, their faces hollow with the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much. He kept this picture on his desk for 60 years, the bishop said, his voice breaking. Every night before bed, he prayed for the soldier who lost 3 toes to save his life. The soldier who made sure 11 boys met their maker with clean souls. He called you his guardian angel. Marcus's legs gave out completely. He would have collapsed if the bishop hadn't caught him. Strong arms holding him steady, while 7 decades of guilt and grief poured out in broken sobs. The weight of 11 souls carried alone for so long suddenly felt shared. "You kept your promise," Bishop Patterson whispered, his own tears falling now. "Every single one of them. Patrick told me about the dog tags, about how you collected their last words, how you promised them they wouldn't be forgotten, that their names would be remembered." The courtyard had fallen silent. Even the children playing in the distance had stopped their games, somehow sensing they were witnessing something sacred, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human experience. "Today," the bishop announced, his voice carrying across the cathedral grounds with the power of absolute conviction, "we're not just burying my brother. We're finally honoring 11 boys who died heroes in Korea and the man who made sure their souls found peace." The transformation was immediate. Where there had been confusion and judgment, now there was understanding. Where there had been dismissal, now there was reverence. What happened next transformed everyone who witnessed it. Bishop Patterson took Marcus's trembling hands in his own and helped him gather the 11 dog tags from their circle on the fallen leaves. Together they walked through the cathedral doors, the crowd parting before them in absolute silence. The massive sanctuary was packed with hundreds of mourners, bishops, priests, deacons, and distinguished guests from across the country who had come to honor Monsignor Patrick O'Brien. The funeral mass came to a complete halt as the two men approached the altar, the organist's hands stilled on the keys. The choir fell silent mid-verse. Every eye in the cathedral followed their procession down the center aisle, the soft metallic chiming of the dog tags the only sound in the vast space. With infinite care, Bishop Patterson helped Marcus arrange the 11 dog tags on top of Monsignor O'Brien's casket. Each piece of metal caught the cathedral light streaming through stained glass windows, creating small rainbows on the polished mahogany wood. The tags formed a perfect circle around a simple wooden cross, 11 soldiers surrounding the symbol of the faith they died defending. "Ladies and gentlemen," the bishop's voice echoed through the packed cathedral, amplified not just by the acoustics, but by the weight of absolute truth. "Today, we honor not just one servant of God, but 12. 11 boys who gave their lives in service to freedom and one man who has carried their memory for 71 years. The congregation, bishops in their purple robes, priests in their black cassocks, deacons in their white vestments, rose as one. The sound of hundreds of people standing filled the cathedral like thunder, a rustling of fabric and shuffling of feet that seemed to shake the ancient stones themselves. Marcus stood beside the casket, his weathered hands steady now for the first time in decades. The tags seemed to glow in the cathedral light, as if the souls they represented had finally found peace. He began the roll call he'd carried in his heart for 7 decades, his voice growing stronger with each name. "Coleman, Thomas R. killed in action, Hill 847, November 15, 1952, age 19. Last words. Tell Mama her pie recipe dies with me. She'll need to teach someone else now. Present," the congregation responded, their voices joining in a chorus Marcus had never imagined possible. Hundreds of voices speaking in unison, acknowledging a boy who had died before most of them were born. Rodriguez Miguel A. killed in action. Hill 847, November 15, 1952, age 20. Last words. The snow. It's so beautiful here, like Christmas morning back home. Present. One by one, Marcus called out the names. One by one, the cathedral filled with voices honoring boys who had died in a frozen valley on the other side of the world. Men and women who had dedicated their lives to God now bore witness to a different kind of faith, the faith of a 19-year-old soldier who refused to let his brothers die alone and forgotten. Each name came with its story, each story with its weight. Patterson, William C. Dow, who had worried about his wedding ring. Thompson, James L., who had tried to recite the 23rd Psalm. Morrison, Daniel P., who had spoken of angels. Kim, David S., who had died believing he could hear heavenly music. 11 boys, 11 stories, 11 souls finally acknowledged by the world they died defending. When the final name was called, Morrison, Daniel P. killed in action, Hill 847, November 15, 1952, age 18, last words. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down. And the silence was absolute and sacred. Bishop Patterson placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder with the solemnity of a military honor guard. "Brother Marcus," he said, using the formal address reserved for the most honored members of the church community, "by the authority granted to me by God and the United States Military Chaplaincy, I hereby declare that you have fulfilled your sacred duty to these 11 souls." The bishop turned to face the congregation, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast cathedral. "Let it be known that a chapel in this cathedral will be dedicated to the memory of the Hill 847 platoon and to the promise keeper who ensured their spirits found eternal rest." As the Mass concluded with a blessing that seemed to encompass not just the living but the long dead, something extraordinary happened. One by one, members of the congregation approached Marcus, each touching one of the dog tags and whispering a prayer. Veterans, clergy, civilians, all drawn to honor boys they had never met but would never forget. For the first time in 71 years, Marcus Williams was not alone with his burden. The 11 souls he had carried were finally home, and Marcus Williams, the last guardian of Hill 847, could finally let them rest in peace. Thank you for typing PROMISE. Subscribe for more stories of unbreakable bonds. Support our mission through Buy Me a Coffee. Link in the first pinned comment. Until next time, some promises transcend death itself.